Hey there folks, this is a thank you video to say thanks to all the Facebook likes and follows on the Eastern Antique Arms page. We've just passed 3,000 likes. We've passed 3,000 follows a while ago. Some people follow and don't like. I don't actually know the difference. But anyway, thank you for the 3,000 likes. It's really great. Obviously that page is useful for me sending updates regarding the stuff that I'm buying and selling. And general information about swords, but I do try and post some sort of articles and photographs of interest as well for people who are interested in antique swords. And just as a thank you, I just thought I'd show you a sword. I don't think I've shown this on video before. This is the sword of Lieutenant Ralph Ivan Maynell Davidson, and there's a few things to say about it. But firstly, I want to say we have to remember when we're dealing with these antique objects that these were sometimes taken to war. And in this specific case, unfortunately, the officer in question, Lieutenant Davidson, was shot in the head by a German sniper in 1914. So he was from a military family. His father and grandfather, I believe, had served in India and elsewhere in the British Army. He himself joined the Manchester Regiment. And he ordered this special order sword, which I'll talk a little bit more about the sword in a second. And obviously went to war, 1914, right at the beginning of the war, shot in the head. You have to remember officers in particular were targets for snipers, and officers died at a very high rate, higher rate than the normal private soldiers in World War I. And in fact, a lot of people have this idea about World War I as of the commanders sort of being at the back and sending waves of kind of recruits in to be mown down. And this is actually incorrect. Generals died at a very high rate in World War I, and a lot of quite high-ranking officers did actually lead from the front and were based at the front. In fact, my very own great-grandfather was a colonel in the Royal Army Medical Corps during World War I, survived World War I, but he was at the front line hospitals, field hospitals at Ypres, for example, and elsewhere, and he actually suffered from the effects of mustard and chlorine gas. In fact, he was mostly chlorine gassed rather than mustard gassed, and he himself was treating gas victims as well. And he didn't live very long after the war partly because of the effects of gas. So sometimes the casualties of war weren't just the people who died in war, but also the people who died after war as a result of either emotional or physical damage. But to the swords. So does the patent or full width tang actually really increase the strength of the sword? Well, I think technically it probably does, but in practical terms, it's very rare to break a tang anyway. So I think it's partly a sales gimmick, although you can't argue with the fact that technically, yes, it does increase the overall strength of the sword slightly. One byproduct of having the full width tang, incidentally, is the hilts very rarely come loose. So if you get a patent tang or patent hilt sword, then it's fairly rare that there'll be any movement in the hilt whatsoever because everything's kind of riveted to the tang. How's it constructed? Well, essentially the full width tang, a bit like a kitchen knife for example, has holes, lateral holes through the tang. So the first thing that goes on is you slide the guard on. There's a little bit of a shoulder up here, just a very slight shoulder for the guard to sit up against. The guard goes on. Then you put the ferrule goes on next, the ferrule goes on, then the grip scales go on either side of the tang and have two or sometimes more pins going through laterally. Okay, so they can't ever move up or down, they're just pinned to the sides of the tang. And then the bottom of the guard sits over a hole, so you've got a little thread coming out from the tang at the bottom. The guard goes over there, and there is a nut. So inside this pommel is hollow, it's like a dome, and inside there is a nut, a normal hex nut. The ones that I've seen come apart or taken apart to clean or refurbish or whatever do have a normal hex nut inside. So there's a normal hex nut which then holds the guard tight against the grips, and then this back strap is the final piece to go on, except for the nut, that is, the final large piece, and the back strap slides on with a little tongue that goes inside underneath that ferrule. Goes on over the threaded end of the tang here, and then a nut here is screwed on as tight as it can go, and then it's filed off so that it's round and doesn't look like a ugly hex nut at the end. So there's actually two nuts in there. There's one internal nut and there's one external nut. The external nut is only holding the back strap on, which is hiding the internal nut. Quite simply, Lieutenant Davidson ordered a special order sword. He would have paid extra to have the patent telling it, quite a bit extra, something like sort of, I think, 25 to 50% on top of the normal price of the sword. It's been very well service sharpened, so one of the last, I believe the last order in the British Army to sharpen swords, and that referred not just to swords but also to bayonets and lances and everything else, cutlasses. The last order to sharpen swords was before World War I, so in 1914, and so the sword has been extensively sharpened, not just with an edge bevel, but it's actually been reprofiled so that there's almost no bevel. So from here upwards it is sharp edged, although it's obviously the 1897 pattern infantry officer's sword, so it's primarily geared towards thrusting, but you could cut with it to some extent. You could certainly annoy someone quite a lot by hitting them hard with it. It's a stiff, relatively heavy blade, so it will do some percussive damage, and obviously if it's edged it will focus that damage. So it's edged from there up, and of course slightly on the false edge at the top. And so he bought a good sword. He had it well sharpened. He went to the continental Europe, France, in 1914. And unfortunately got shot in the head. As we all know, World War I panned out to be a very different kind of war to what some of the nations involved in it expected it to be. Certainly the British Army, I think, although it had been prepared somewhat by the Boer War, and it had studied the Franco-Prussian War a lot, which you could say the Franco-Prussian War was the precursor to World War I in many ways. But much of the British forces had been based in India and had fought in the Sudan and places like this, and had been involved in colonial conflicts, the Boxer Rebellion and so on and so forth. Obviously the Boer War was the second Anglo-Boer War, was an eye-opener and was very useful training, and a lot of the best trained and most experienced soldiers at the beginning of World War I had fought in the Boer War. So that was a useful training ground for them, where they came up against an opponent using long-range German rifles, as it happened, Mausers mostly. Yeah, so that was a useful training ground for them. But really, officers with swords in World War I were not so much a thing anymore. It should be said, so most British officers gave up their swords in field service, and they were put back into storage. Some were sent home, some were just put into the regimental armoury. They did keep them for parade occasions, but in the field they took to carrying a walking stick or a swagger stick, something like that, and just for pointing at things as a sign of rank, and a revolver. Of course, they had been using revolvers since way back, since the Crimean War, but the revolver became their principal weapon, not the sword. This being said, this was in the early First World War, and actually as we go later into the First World War and it became more trench warfare, it broke out from that at the end thanks to aeroplanes and tanks, but in trench warfare, ironically, they suddenly found that hand weapons were very useful again. And so things like trench clubs and obviously bayonets and trench knives and these types of things, even something wacky things like flails and stuff, started to be used quite a lot in particularly in night fighting in trenches, but also in day fighting in trenches as well. And we should also remember that the First World War covered a very wide area, and swords were used quite extensively in Eastern Europe, and they were also used relatively extensively in the Middle East and North Africa as well. So the Lawrence's kind of Arab revolt and that kind of stuff, the Bedouin used swords quite a bit, as well as rifles. And there are definitely quite a lot of instances of swords being used in World War I by cavalry still. And at the beginning of World War I, when everything was more mobile, and at the end of World War I, when everything was more mobile, cavalry swords saw quite extensive use. And what many people don't know is the first confirmed kill by a British soldier in World War I was done with a cavalry sword against a German cavalry scout. So swords absolutely were used in World War I. It's just that specifically for British infantry officers in Europe, they weren't very useful. There were other areas and there were other types of soldier for which swords were useful and were used, but for British infantry officers with swords who were mostly, for most of the war, stuck in a trench, swords weren't particularly useful, and for trench raiding they found that a revolver and a club, or a revolver and a trench knife or bayonet or whatever, was more useful. So there we go. This poor chap, Lieutenant Davidson, I mean, he signed up, he knew what he was getting into, but poor guy, he didn't get to see much of the war. Shot right at the beginning, and we should remember that when we're handling these objects, they are parts of history. They're not just a sword. They are very, very much more than that, and I never would have heard of Lieutenant Davidson if this sword hadn't come into my possession. And it's a very good reminder that in war, people die. Sons, brothers, fathers, and civilians as well die in war, and it's a horrible thing. So we love swords, but we shouldn't forget what they represent and what they were used for, and what they went through in some cases. But we should also remember that also in many cases they saved lives and they protected people. So swords are many, many things to many different people. Thanks for watching. Thanks again for supporting the Eastern Antique Arms Facebook page. 3,000 likes, yay. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you really soon for another one. Cheers, folks.